Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Heather Isvaran, and with me today is Dr. Fathali Moghaddam, Director of the Conflict Resolution Program at Georgetown University and distinguished faculty member here at the Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Today we want to talk about your new book, The New Global Insecurity. And you're discussing why we should think of insecurity as global. How do we know it's not something local?
Well, that's a good question. To some extent, insecurity is personal and local. But in the new era of what I call fractured globalization, because of the increasing interconnectedness that has been achieved, we are now affected by events in very remote areas like Yemen and Afghanistan. And globalization is taking place in such a way that has made security a global rather than just a local issue.
You've used the term fractured globalization to argue that 21st century globalization is new and is having new consequences. But what about the argument that globalization is as old as the Roman Empire?
Well, in some ways it is. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, they all had extensive reach. But there are new things about globalization. For example, the pace of technological change, the reach of technological change, these are all new. Just think about how in the last 20 years the internet has impacted all of us, not just in the United States, but in third world countries. Many third world countries have internet now. In many places, people don't even have landlines for telephones. They have the kinds of telephones we use over here. So the 15-year-old using the mobile in a third world country is very connected through the internet to the rest of the world. So in that sense, globalization is new. Also, the speed of change and the interconnectedness of economic events, as we witnessed in the last few years since 2008, there's a dramatic change in the way in which economic changes in one country impact others, and it's very difficult for even the United States to remain isolated. So what is new about globalization in the 21st century is first the speed of technological and economic changes, second the interconnectedness that means that places like Yemen and Afghanistan now are impacting us. For example, think about the 19th century. The British Empire, of course, was concerned with places such as Yemen and Afghanistan, but they never thought of those places as sources of insecurity. Even 20 years ago, the main concern of the United States was still the Soviet Union, and the issue of security was discussed in the context of the Cold War still. But now, of course, it's not just China and Russia and the great powers that concern us when it comes to security. It's the places that might, in terms of traditional military strength, be very weak, but in other respects, such as terrorism and the threat of bioterrorism, etc., might seem to be quite important. So in these respects, globalization and security are very much interconnected.
You've presented a new model of security from a psychological perspective and have claimed that psychology has a contribution to make to security studies. Why do you think there is a need for a psychological model in addition to the realist and human security approaches to security?
Well, the traditional approach is, the realist approach still is the dominant one. It focuses mostly on military strength. That still is very relevant. From around the early 1990s, the human security approach gained momentum, and In the human security approach, the emphasis is on food, shelter, basic healthcare, education, etc. So it focuses much more on what's called the soft side of security. And there has been a continual rivalry between these two camps. My argument is that these are interdependent. I see human security as enabling military security. But that's not all, because in the new global environment, insecurity is very much related to identity, and collective identity in particular. The reason why we have terrorism as a major issue in the 21st century is because of collective threatened identities and the feeling that certain minorities have that they are going to be wiped out by the expanding and accelerating globalization that they see to be coming from the United States and secularization from the West in general.
Interesting. Your emphasis on irrationality implies a Freudian influence. Is this not out of date? Does Freud not seem irrelevant to 21st century ideas and science?
Well, that's a very good question again. Certainly in some respects, Freud is out of date and was always incorrect, I think. However, there are aspects of Freud's work that are timeless. I think his real genius is in the way in which he discussed intergroup conflict and showed great insight into the human capacity for war and the reasons why we engage in aggression. Particularly his focus on irrationality in the conflict process. The fact that we go to war again and again, but we try to justify these wars through rational explanations. We go to war explaining that we are for peace. Now, this is nothing to do with being a Republican or a Democrat. It's a human characteristic. If we look back over our known history in the last 12,000 years or so, the one continuous theme is conflict and war. And yet we continually deny that we are engaged in war, even when we are embarking on war. So in that respect, Freud is very much relevant, the theme of irrationality, particularly when it comes to feeling secure and feeling insecure. Often our feelings of insecurity are irrational. For example, when 9/11 occurred, one of the psychological consequences was, of course, on people in the New York area. But then Americans in remote regions of the country, Americans who were not likely to be hit by terrorist attacks, saw themselves under attack as well. So there is, to some extent, irrationality involved in this. Also, of course, when we look at the global situation and consider the reactions of certain fundamentalists to globalization, that is also, I think, an irrational, dysfunctional reaction.
You've described both terrorism and torture as examples of irrational responses to a perceived threat. Can you explain how this fits in with the idea of fractured globalization?
Yes, there are a number of reactions to globalization we can identify as being dysfunctional and irrational. I've homed in this book on terrorism and torture in particular. I see those to be very related to one another. They are both activities that the perpetrators try to rationalize, just as terrorists attempt to rationalize what they are doing. Those who torture try to rationalize what they are doing. But the fact is that in both instances, the rational explanations don't go very far. For example, the explanation given for the use of torture is often the ticking bomb scenario. The notion that we are justified in using torture because there's vital information that we need. There's a ticking bomb, and in order to get the location of that ticking bomb, we have to torture this particular person and get the results. Well, first of all, if you talk to interrogators, professional interrogators, and I've done this, we had a meeting at Georgetown where we had military interrogators with hundreds of years of experience between them. They all denied ever having come across such a scenario. The ticking bomb scenario is really a myth. A second thing is that when you look at the actual instances of torture, torture is often used as a form of retribution. It's a form of punishment. It's actually better explained through displacement of aggression. If you look at situations where torture is being used, often the tortured person will explain that, way past the time when I had given them all the information I had, they were still torturing me. And it had nothing to do, it seemed, with information. It had to do with punishment. There are lots of these cases from not just Western countries, but third world countries, where people who have suffered torture have recounted their experiences. And it's pretty clear that the real deep reasons for carrying out torture is not to get information. It's to make people suffer and to fear. It's a way of instilling fear in a population. And in many countries, the governments don't mind to let it be known that they do carry out torture, because that's a way of keeping the populations and their enemies under control. In this sense, torture and terrorism are very similar, because terrorism also attempts to instill fear in a population and to control that population's behavior. For example, the real goal of terrorists trying to attack the United States is really to instill fear in the US population. And one could argue that they have succeeded to change behavior in some ways, at least to waste a lot of our time. Just think about the millions of man-hours we spend in lines at airports. The cost of that alone is enormous. So the rationalizations given for activities such as terrorism and torture really need to be looked at again. I think these are irrational processes.
In discussing policy solutions to the new global insecurity, you have criticized both multiculturalism and assimilation, the two traditional policies. Why is this?
Well, when we look at intergroup relations, both nationally and internationally, it's obvious we need better policies. The traditional policies have been, first of all, assimilation, where groups interact and they basically develop lifestyles that are more and more similar. So they melt into one another. It's a melting pot idea. Now this, to some extent, jives with globalization. Globalization leading to greater and greater similarity between people around the world, minority cultures and languages dying out. Language death takes place continuously. About 2 or 3 languages die every month, and minority cultures are dying out as well. So at one level, one could argue that assimilation is taking place through globalization, and assimilation takes place at national and international levels. However, there's a fight back. There's a very strong reaction against assimilation, both nationally and internationally. Minority groups, various religious groups are making a stand, and I think part of the explanation for terrorism and fundamentalism is exactly this, a reaction against assimilating, becoming like everybody else. And one of the solutions that has arisen is multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is the new politically correct approach, the policy for managing diversity. Multiculturalism was adopted officially in Canada first in 1972, then in Australia, New Zealand, and gradually in the United States. The politically correct policy at the moment in most places in the US is multiculturalism. And the idea there has been to celebrate differences, highlight differences, in order to build up self-esteem among minorities in particular. This has actually led to people going back to their past histories, manufacturing a different culture for themselves. Now, there are all kinds of problems with multiculturalism. One of the problems is that it is highlighting differences and exaggerating differences and avoiding or neglecting commonalities. Also, I believe one of the consequences of multiculturalism in the education system has been basically to tell certain minorities that they are different, they needn't try. So we have about 100 million, a third of the US population consisting of African Americans and Hispanics, and they're not doing particularly well in education. This is a problem. The US cannot afford for a third of the population to be not doing well in education. Of course, there are other groups not doing well as well, but this is the largest group. Mm-hmm. I believe we need a different solution, both at national and international levels, and the solution I'm putting forward is omniculturalism, omni meaning all. And this alternative solution is discussed in the final chapter of my book, The New Global Insecurity. I believe omniculturalism to be a better policy for dealing with the new global insecurity. The first stage in omniculturalism is to teach people, the young in particular, about human commonalities. So the question is, what do humans have in common? What are their universals? And there are important universals. Psychological science points to those. So we know human beings are the same in fundamental ways. And that's the first thing we need to learn, so that children grow up learning that everyone as a human being is similar in certain important ways. Also, that we all have certain duties and rights. Not just rights, but duties. And that's very important. Once this has been established, at a second stage, we can introduce group differences, but never highlighting them or exaggerating them to the extent that we do the similarities. I think we need to shift to an omnicultural approach, especially internationally.
So are there any best practices from that? I mean, I look at the Native American culture, and what have we learned from, that approach and how it didn't work in terms of preserving their culture? Are there other cultures that may have succeeded in preserving that culture while assimilating into the larger group?
Well, I think we can learn from some groups that have succeeded better, and some that haven't done well at all. It's a matter of looking around the world and seeing which groups we want to highlight more, their methods, etc. My own sense is that we have to keep in mind the distinction between real differences and symbolic differences. Even in situations where there are really no big real differences between groups, people will pick on certain symbols, what I've called carriers. A carrier is a means of propagating your culture, your values, and they'll pick on those carriers and they will highlight their importance so that they can be different from other groups. For example, at the moment, what I've called a sacred carrier is the Islamic veil that women are forced to wear in some countries, such as Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, fundamentalists have highlighted the importance of the Islamic veil. Why? Because they want to make sure there's a difference between them and others. Now, looking around the world, we can learn good lessons from groups, but we have to do it carefully. I'm not suggesting that we wipe out group differences. What I'm suggesting is that we begin education in particular by teaching the young what a human being is and what all human beings have in common. Starting from there, we instill ideas about human duties and rights, and after that we talk about differences.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. Good luck with the book. It's coming out at the end of the month.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
The New Global Insecurity by Dr. Fathali Moghaddam.